Thank you for joining us. My name is Janina Brede, and I'm going to let the others introduce themselves when it's their time to speak, but I'm just briefly going to say a little bit about myself. So I'm a researcher, and I'm currently also training to be a clinical psychologist. And as part of my PhD research that I completed in 2021, I worked with some autistic women on research on autistic women's experience of eating disorders. And as a trainee clinical psychologist, which is my current role, I get to work in different NHS mental health services, for example, to deliver therapy. And yeah, as we already said, we are here today to talk about research related to autistic adults' experience in mental health services. So I thought it would be helpful to start off by providing a bit of an overview of what we will cover today. So I will start off by saying a little bit about why it's so important to better understand autistic adults' experience of mental health services. So why does it matter? And then I will present the findings of a systematic review of research covering autistic adults' experience of mental health services. So this is a way of reviewing existing research studies on a particular topic and sort of pulling together key lessons that we can learn from these studies in a systematic way. And then we would like to hear your views, so the audience views, in a little word cloud exercise. And I will say a little bit more about that when we get to it. And then Ailsa will talk about suggestions of how services can be improved, and she will also talk about some ongoing research that aims to inform this. And at the end, Kana will talk about her research on the experience of loneliness among autistic adults and will draw some parallels to their experiences in mental health services. And hopefully we will have 10 minutes or so at the end for questions before we finish. So why does it matter? Well, mental health difficulties are really common among autistic individuals, and research has shown that up to 80% of autistic adults experience at least one mental health difficulty, with up to 57% meeting criteria for multiple co-occurring conditions. And here are some of the most common conditions. So things like ADHD, depression, anxiety, but almost all mental health difficulties are more commonly experienced by autistic than non-autistic people. And of course, that affects autistic people's quality of life and well-being and that of their families. And sadly, it also contributes to premature mortality. So autistic people are much more likely to die by suicide than non-autistic people. So clearly it's important to support autistic people with their mental health, but despite this, existing services seem to work less well for autistic individuals, particularly once they reach adulthood. So research has found that autistic adults report higher levels of unmet mental health needs than non-autistic people. This means that many autistic people likely are not accessing mental health services and getting support that they could benefit from. And when they do access these services, autistic adults report being less satisfied compared to services for physical health difficulties. So there seems to be something quite specific about experiences in mental health settings. And finally, we also know from research that autistic people tend to require more intense forms of care than non-autistic people with comparable levels of mental health difficulties. So again, this suggests that whatever is being offered in mental health services is currently working less well for autistic people. And we wanted to better understand what it's like for autistic adults when they try to get help from mental health services. And when I say we, I'm referring to the Autistica mental health study group. So we are a group of autistic people, parents and researchers, and some of us fit into more than one of those categories. And we got together with the help of Autistica to co-develop initiatives to make it easier to do high quality research and also to get more funding for research related to mental health. Because as many of you will be aware, this is an area that has been identified as a research priority by and for the autism community. And when we started to look into this question, we realized that actually quite a bit of research had already been done on this. So a subgroup of us got together and conducted what is called a systematic review, which is basically a way of bringing together and summarizing existing research studies. And at this point, I just quickly want to say thank you to all the other study group members and the other authors who were involved in this work. Even though we get to present it today, it has been quite a team effort. So let me talk you through the steps that were involved in the systematic review. I know this is quite a technical term, so not everyone might know what is involved in this. So we did quite an elaborate search and looked at over 12,000 possible studies that have been done, and we ended up with 38 studies that were relevant to our question. And these studies focused on the views of autistic adults, of parents, and of healthcare professionals, and they used methods such as interviews or small group discussions to find out the views of their participants. And then we summarized the findings across studies. And this was helpful because it shows us what research so far is telling us. And we can use this knowledge to make recommendations to improve services and also find out what research might still need to be done. So this is the full paper here that was published, and we also published a lay summary on the Autistica website, and hopefully that link will be shared with you now, and if not, we can share that after the presentation. So before I summarize the experiences and views of participants in those studies, I wanted to say a little bit more about the 38 studies that we ended up including. So for each of them, we considered who took part in the study and what they focused on. And that's important because it tells us whose experiences might be underrepresented and which areas we still know less about. Most of the studies were done in the UK, in Canada, or the US, but there were very few studies completed in the rest of the world. And all studies looked at autistic adults' experience of mental health care in some way. Some of them more generally, but some also focused on specific types of therapies or places where the treatment happened, for example, in a hospital. And there were also a few studies that looked at the service experience of those with specific types of mental health difficulties. So for example, eating disorders, anxiety, or self-harm. And some studies focus on specific groups like autistic young adults or autistic women. However, only a few studies included autistic adults who also had learning disabilities. And similarly, few studies included people that were Black, Asian, or from other minoritized backgrounds. So looking at that, we can already tell a little bit who is well represented and whose experiences we might still know less about based on these existing research studies. So as I said, we read all the studies and we summarized the findings, and we organized the views that participants shared across the study into 3 themes. And I will now talk through each of these themes and say a little bit more about each of them. So the first overarching theme was lonely, difficult service experience. Sadly, most of the autistic adults described having quite negative experiences in mental health services, and there were sort of 2 sub-themes within that. So they reported that lots of things got in the way of them trying to get help, so they had difficulties accessing support in the first place. And some of them didn't recognize that they were necessarily struggling or that their problems were actually related to mental health. So they didn't know that they could get help for mental health services. And this is a quote by one of the participants from one of the studies related to that. People also said that they didn't know how and where to ask for help. And they said that the professionals that autistic people had contact with did not seem to know much about autism, and from their experience didn't really try to make things easier for autistic people. And professionals who took part in the studies that we included in this review said that they felt they needed extra training and extra resources to better help autistic people, but usually they didn't get these. And for many autistic people, having these difficult experiences with services understandably was an additional source of stress and potentially even made their mental health worse. And it also affected their trust in services and their motivation to ask for help in the future. So this is a quote from another study from a different participant that sort of illustrates that. And not getting the support that they needed could be a strain on their relationships with their family and friends. And some participants also felt that they had to rely on medication because there weren't really any other options for them. The second overarching theme was complexity needs flexibility. And the first point in this is that autistic people saw their autism and their mental health as separate, but also intertwined. So being autistic can affect how mental health difficulties present, and it can also affect what autistic people require from services in terms of potentially additional needs. So this is a quote related to this. And across the studies, there were various suggestions what could make treatment easier or better for autistic people. So this, for example, included adaptations to communication or the environment in which treatment takes place to make it more accessible for those with sensory sensitivities. And this is a quote by a participant who talks about how sensory overload affected them while they were in an inpatient setting. And many autistic people also said that they found sudden changes quite difficult, particularly when their mental health wasn't well. So a clear structure could make treatment more tolerable for these individuals. And participants across studies highlighted that services should try to be as flexible as possible and also comprehensive, so linking in with all parts of the person's life. For example, in terms of flexibility, autistic people might need more sessions than what is usually offered, or they might need shorter ones or longer ones with breaks in between to make the most out of the treatment that they're given. And also recovery might look different for autistic individuals. So expectations and goals might need to be adjusted. And related to this, some participants in the study said that the outcome measures that are quite often used in services to track how people are doing, but that weren't necessarily developed with autistic people in mind, might not apply to them as much or might not be as relevant for autistic people. And also some studies suggested that it could be helpful to offer peer support in mental health settings. The third overarching theme was collaboration needs empowerment. So participants talked about that it's important for autistic people to be able to trust the person they're working with. And autistic adults valued working with the same person rather than with lots of different individuals, as this quote exemplifies. And it seems important to listen to autistic adults, to engage them in decision-making about their care, and also as treating them as experts of their own experience. And that should really be a given, but it wasn't always experienced in that way. And this is a quote by a therapist who took part in one of the studies, who described the attitude that they believed clinicians need to hold for this to be in place. So for many, the ultimate goal was really for autistic adults to develop independence and autonomy in managing their mental health outside of the service context. And for those who did find treatment helpful, they felt they were in a better place to manage their mental health on their own in the future. So to finish off with, this is a bit more of an uplifting quote. And I suppose this last theme gives us a bit of an idea what things could look like when they're going well. So to summarize, our review suggests that currently mental health services do not seem to adequately support autistic adults, and they may even cause additional harm. And there is a need for a more comprehensive, flexible, and holistic approach, considering how being autistic affects the individual's mental health presentation and also their needs for support. And building trusting relationships, listening to autistic adults, and empowering them to take agency appear to be fundamental steps towards more successful mental health care provision. Before I hand over to Ailsa, we would like to hear your views at this point. So the existing research predominantly focuses on negative experiences and barriers and challenges that autistic people face when engaging with mental health services, but there's less of a focus currently on what aspects of mental health care are experienced as helpful and why. But we are sure there are examples of good practice out there that we can learn from. So we would like to create a word cloud with your help using Mentimeter. And our questions are, what would you like mental health services to do more of for autistic people? And if you are an autistic person and have had experience of accessing mental health services, what were some positive aspects of that? What has worked well for you and what would you like to see more of? So you can go to menti.com and enter this code here, or you can use the QR code, and then you will be prompted to enter your responses. And if you enter your responses via Menti, they will be completely anonymous. And of course, this is voluntarily. You don't have to do it. I will just move over to Menti, and I can see that some people are already sharing their views. Thank you so much for that. So I hope you can all see this word cloud shaping now. And you can also submit the same responses again, and then those words will come up bigger in the middle of the word cloud. So we get a lot of listening. That seems to be core, and that reflects our research findings. Punctuality is an interesting one, and I think that shows that there are expectations of the mental health services as well to be reliable and stick to what has been agreed. Adjustments are in the middle here. Lovely. Thank you so much, everyone who is submitting responses. Thinking out of the box, yeah. Be willing to learn. Again, something that has also come up in our research. Patience, understanding. I think we can wait a little bit longer because it's still changing. People keep submitting responses. Providing a safe space, I think that is really important, yeah. I can see here online appointments as well, which I think is an interesting one. They seem to work really well for some autistic people, but not so well for others. And I think that links in with this theme around flexibility and adapting to what works best for the person to access the care that is provided. Be informed. I think there is some accountability on services to do the work as well and not rely on autistic people to teach them. There's a lot to take in here. We will take a screenshot of this at the end. So keep submitting your responses and then maybe Autistica has a way to share this because I think this is really valuable and there's lots of helpful advice and guidance out there. Right. I wonder if we should move on and maybe Ailsa can join now. And I can start sharing her slides.
Thank you so much, Janina.
No problem. I will just try to take my picture off. Yeah, right. And also mute myself.
Okay. And if you want to let me know when you're ready, because I think you're
Yeah,
moving the slides for me very kindly.
I will do that now. Yes. So
Okay.
I will go back to sharing the slides and I mute my.
Okay. Janina, thank you so much for presenting our research from the study group so clearly. So just to say hello to everyone, my name is Ailsa Russell. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'm interested in working with others to improve mental health interventions for autistic people. So Janina's given a really nice overview of our paper, which gives really clear suggestions about how services can improve. Some of those suggestions are simple and, well, relatively simple, and wouldn't take a lot of time or money in terms of extra resources. This includes things like raising awareness among referrers and those people who manage mental health services. Supporting others to kind of tailor their communication and address sensory stressors, and giving autistic adults themselves really clear information and support to navigate the system. Other suggestions, however, are a bit more complex to put in place and require more money and flexibility in the way services are run. And they might also require training and support for professionals and research to test whether these changes make a difference. So if we think about things like tailoring existing treatment approaches or developing new interventions, we need to be really sure that these are better than what's already available. So we need to really get some good evidence to find out, yes, this new intervention would be the most effective thing for autistic people. So what do we know about the sorts of treatments and whether or not they work for autistic people with mental health difficulties? So what is the state of the evidence base? So while our review that Janina's described so nicely focused on autistic adults' experience of mental health services, another group of researchers, so led by Lyndon and colleagues, very recently conducted a systematic review and published that. So it's sort of very hot off the press. And they did a meta-analysis of studies that tested how effective different interventions are in improving mental health outcomes for autistic people. And they looked at specific kinds of research studies that generally make up the evidence base and clinical guidelines. So these are typically randomized controlled trials, or RCTs for short. And these type of studies are really well suited to test the effectiveness of an intervention, although they do come with their own limitations. But essentially, an RCT compares the outcome of two different interventions in two very similar groups of people with the same difficulties. And an RCT can then tell us whether one intervention is more effective than another in addressing the difficulties those people are experiencing. So the Linden review found that there is a lot of uncertainty about the effects of different interventions for mental health conditions experienced by autistic people. There were some indications that some types of cognitive behavior therapy, or CBT, and mindfulness might be useful. But the review really highlighted that there's a need to develop a much more robust evidence base for tailored interventions. So we do need more research to adapt treatment and test whether or not these treatments work for autistic people. And the authors really concluded that until the evidence base and the research is developed, until this happens, autistic people should be given full access to the mental health interventions as they're currently available. So I wanted to talk about research, and we thought it would be helpful to illustrate how research can support developing the evidence base with a particular case study, actually, to kind of show you how this can happen and how we can all work together to try and improve what's available for autistic adults who have mental health difficulties. So I wanted to talk about a research study which has been looking at a psychological intervention for autistic adults who are experiencing depression. And that's a problem, as Janina mentioned earlier, that can affect many autistic people. And there are treatments around for depression that have really good evidence. For example, low intensity CBT, or cognitive behavior therapy. Low intensity means that evidence-based information is provided to the person who wants who's experiencing depression, and then a therapist or a coach supports the person to personalize that information so they can kind of apply it for themselves and use it effectively. This is sometimes called guided self-help. But actually, the low intensity CBT for depression that is kind of around and offered by the NHS was not developed with autistic people in mind. So we really wanted to know, and the National Institute for Health Research wanted to know, is this low intensity CBT for depression effective for autistic people? So we started the process of working towards understanding this question. And there's some guidance from the Medical Research Council about how a complex intervention like this should be developed and evaluated. So we followed this guidance in our research. So the first step from the MRC framework is to identify or develop an intervention. And we had to get funding and set up a study team and then think about what's the intervention we wanted to really evaluate and test. So because low intensity CBT can take lots of different forms, we decided to focus on something that's called behavioral activation, or BA. It's a sort of one form of CBT for depression, and it focuses on situations and behaviors as well as feelings. It doesn't focus so much on changing thoughts, which can be a part of CBT, but that can be something that autistic people can sometimes find a bit more tricky. So we knew BA, or behavior activation as it stood, wouldn't quite fit the bill. We would need to make some adaptations in line with the needs of autistic people. So we needed to make sure it was still the key ingredients or the effective components of behavioral activation, but also tailor it so that it was suited for autistic people. And we had the help of a small group of autistic adults who really helped us to do that in terms of what the information should look like, what we should include, what should the materials look like in terms of visuals, how should the principles and the sessions flow. And we also developed a manual for the therapists. So who were going to support people so that they could kind of work more effectively. So we started with funding for this study in December 2015, and we finished in May 2018. So about 3 years to get to do that. And the next step was to find out, actually, is this is this a kind of helpful? Is it feasible to actually run a randomized controlled trial of our adapted intervention? So there's lots of time and work and money goes into, as you can probably already begin to tell, when you're running a research study. So if you're going to really test out an intervention, you want to do a sort of smaller, more feasibility RCT to make sure that we could run a larger study. So we developed a feasibility RCT, which was called the Autism Depression Trial, or ADEPT. And we wanted to know if autistic people would take part in the study, and would they stay in the intervention, and would they find it acceptable? And could therapists be trained to reliably deliver the intervention? Because if it's not feasible or possible to do those, then it's unlikely to work in the real world clinical settings. So we trained some therapists in 2 NHS services for autistic adults, and we invited adults experiencing depression to take part in the study. And overall, 70 adults joined the study. Half of them were randomly allocated to our new intervention called guided self-help, and half of them were randomly allocated to care as usual. And most people who were allocated to the new intervention completed it, and most people were happy to take part in the study. So indicating that the randomized control trial for this intervention was feasible and acceptable. As part of the study, we also wanted to know what people's experiences was like for those people who'd experienced the intervention. And they told us through these interviews that they found the intervention acceptable, but they also told us in ways it could be improved and it could be a bit better. And they said, and here you can see some of the quotes, that they appreciated having an autism tailored approach. So maybe a therapist coach who understood a bit about how they understand and communicate. And people also described a really good understanding of the principles of the intervention, which was called guided self-help. So it made sense to them, and that's really important and helpful, that it will make sense to people in clinical settings. So somebody described how there were stages or building blocks and how those kind of developed. So you started with a foundation and then you could build from there. So the feasibility study that we finished in 2018 was really promising, but 70 people is not very many. And it was too small a number to see if this form of low intensity CBT or guided self-help was actually effective for depression in autistic adults. So our next step, or the third step in the MRC framework, is to evaluate systematically this new complex intervention. So we're now running another study to test whether the intervention will help more people than it doesn't help. Because one intervention is never going to be right for absolutely everybody. And we need to find out actually, will it be right for more people than it's not right for? And also, very importantly, will anyone be harmed by the intervention? So is this something that will make some people worse? And these are really important things to find out before an intervention can be used in clinical practice. And so this more evaluative or effectiveness RCT is called the ADEPT-2 study, and this started in September 21, and it's going to be running until December 2024. So let's have a look and see what's happening, what's involved at this third step of the framework for developing complex interventions. So using the feedback from our feasibility study, we refined the intervention to make sure that we could respond to that feedback, make it as good as it could be, and we involved another group of autistic adults, some of the same people and some additional people, to help us make the intervention and the materials really well tailored. And now we're running a multi-center randomized controlled trial. So this means we're offering the intervention in multiple regions and different settings. And we'll need 248 autistic people with depression to take part in this study. And people who are suitable to take part and interested to help with the study will either receive the new intervention or what is ordinarily available as best practice treatment for depression in the NHS. And you can see from this flowchart on the slide that people will be asked to attend for measurement, so we'll measure their symptoms of depression and other kind of outcome measures such as quality of life and well-being at multiple time points after they finished, before and after they finished the intervention. And this will tell us whether people got better and whether or not there was a difference between the different types of treatment. And we'll also invite people to interviews to give us a bit more detail about their experience of taking part in the study and their experience of the intervention. So the study is currently ongoing, and we hope that we'll be able to have the answer to the questions at the end of 2024. And if you want to find out more about our study, you can follow the link and find out on the project website. But what I really wanted to highlight was also how many people can be involved in a research study like this. So it's not just the people who take part in the study and receive the intervention, but there are many stakeholders and groups involved. So as you can see from this slide, there's independent study committees who make sure that the study is being run appropriately, advisory groups, the research team, everyone at the different NHS sites, a clinical trials unit, who support the study, and of course all the people who take part. So hopefully from this illustration using the ADEPT study, you can see that since 2015 we've been working quite hard on this, and that actually it's an illustration of how it takes time and patience and a lot of people to answer a complex question and build the evidence base. But at each step on the journey, it helps everyone to learn more and understand more and work together effectively. And so we hope that by the end of 2024, we'll have evidence that will improve the experience of autistic people with depression who access mental health services. And so just thinking about where this fits in with the systematic review that Janina talked about earlier, it's just one example of research that tries to improve autistic people's experiences of mental health services. There are other studies investigating other types of interventions for other mental health problems. But as well as testing out new treatments or complex interventions, we think we also need research to evidence what's good practice and how the services are organized and delivered for autistic people. And we also need research with groups of autistic adults who are underrepresented. So you could see from Janina when she presented the review that people from different ethnic backgrounds and adults with intellectual disability are underrepresented groups in this type of research. So we really think that it's important that research is high quality, so we can be confident in any evidence that's generated. And it's really important to make high quality research that it's very collaborative with all of the stakeholders for whom this research is relevant for. So that includes autistic adults receiving services, commissioners, managers, and staff who are working in those services, so that it can be translated into clinical practice. So I'm going to leave it here. I'm happy to answer any questions at the end, but for now, I'm going to say thank you to Janina for managing the slides, and I'm going to hand over to Kana so that she can tell us a bit more about research that's really relevant.
Thank you, Janina and Ailsa. Hi everyone, my name is Kana Umagami. Today, as part of this webinar, I'll be talking about loneliness in autistic adults. Autistic people have unique social challenges and sociality in relation to loneliness. Next slide, please. And I spent the last 4 years studying loneliness in autistic adults. From my research, I've made 5 suggestions to alleviate loneliness in autistic adults. And one of the suggestions is about helping mental health professionals to learn about this topic. So today I'm very excited to talk about my research in relation to autistic adults' experiences with mental health services. And here is the overview of my presentation. I'll first introduce myself. Then I'll discuss the link between autistic adults' experiences of mental health services and loneliness. And finally, I'll discuss how we can better understand loneliness in autistic adults by presenting you my study on autistic adults' lived experiences of loneliness. So a little about me. I'm autistic and have ADHD, and I'm passionate about supporting autistic people and their families. I recently completed a PhD in psychology at UCL. Alongside with my research, I've been a mentor and consultant to autistic people and their families. I have a master's in counseling from Boston College in the USA, and I also have personal experiences of seeing many different mental health professionals across 3 different countries, UK, USA, and Japan. And if you'd like to know more about my story of mental health and autism, I'd love to talk about this more, but that would be a topic for another day. In my PhD research, I first investigated the topic using systematic review. The review has been published from Journal Autism and it's available online if you are interested. The review identified some areas for future research, and the rest of my PhD research addressed some of them. For example, I examined if and how accurately existing measures of loneliness capture autistic adults' experiences of loneliness and their views and experiences of frequently used measures of loneliness. In my thesis, I made suggestions to adapt an existing loneliness scale. I also explored autistic adults' lived experiences of loneliness before and during the pandemic. Now, I will quickly go over how the review explained earlier in this webinar and loneliness in autistic adults link with each other. First of all, mental ill health is associated with increased loneliness in the general population. And importantly, as mentioned earlier by Janina and Ailsa, autistic adults' experiences of accessing and receiving mental health services while lonely. There are some similarities between autistic adults' experiences with mental health services and those with loneliness. I will mention them as I explain more about loneliness later. There were some common experiences of mental health services and loneliness, which were unique to autistic adults. First, autistic adults felt that self-report measures do not capture autistic experiences. Autistic adults talked about mental health services being based around non-autistic norms, including self-report measures, not capturing autistic experiences. Similarly, in my research, autistic adults described many ways in which completing standardized loneliness scales were difficult for them. Second, autistic adults appreciate a specific form of interaction. The review talked about autistic adults' need for predictability in mental health services, such as set time and clear structure. Similar themes were identified in my research as one of the unique aspects of autistic sociality. Next, I'll present one of my studies and explain more about unique autistic experiences of loneliness. In one of my PhD studies, I explored autistic adults' unique experiences of loneliness. This work hasn't been published yet, but I'll be preparing it for publication soon. The latest UK-based review on tackling loneliness identified the need to gain more understanding of lived experiences of loneliness within subgroups of people, including autistic people. Although there is a lack of scientific evidence, autistic adults have long described their experiences of loneliness through multiple means. There has been an emergence of qualitative research to understand autistic adults' lived experiences of loneliness, but there has been just one study, almost 2020, that exclusively investigated loneliness in autistic adults until my study has been done. Next, I'll explain my methods I used in my research in comparison to the previous study by Elmos to describe the significance of this research. This study was different from previous Elmos study in two important ways. First, I used online surveys, while Elmos study used interviews and focus groups. Second, this study was led by myself, an autistic researcher, and included autistic adults' voices in finalizing the survey, while no indication was found in Elmo's study regarding autistic people's involvement. 203 autistic adults participated in this study. The participant profiles were very similar to those of other online survey research with autistic adults. For example, many participants used spoken language to communicate, educated in mainstream school, and were largely from a white ethnic background. The online survey included questions regarding definitions of loneliness and views and experiences of loneliness, and the data were analyzed using reflexive semantic analysis. From the analysis, 4 themes were identified in understanding autistic adults' unique experiences of loneliness. In the next slides, I will describe each theme in turn. Many autistic adults described an internal conflict between wanting to connect with others and finding social situations difficult. So here is an example quote. Participants described aloneness as a choice, whereas loneliness was described as an unwanted feeling. Sometimes the desire for connection and desire for aloneness appeared to conflict. Participants reported that they enjoyed their own company, but also liked to have some connection with others. One participant said, "I'm happy in my own company, but there are times I wish I had a friend or friend to share interests with." Sometimes aloneness was also felt to be necessary to recover from its exhaustion from socializing. Autistic adults reported feeling stuck and hopeless about the internal conflicts they experienced. One participant said the need to socialize and have good friendships, but also have how social interaction exhausts us. This catch-22 can lead to loneliness. Autistic adults reported a range of different ways in which their longing for connection was difficult to achieve. First, sensory environments in social situations made interactions difficult for autistic adults. Second, a perceived lack of societal understanding and acceptance of autism made it difficult for autistic adults to feel connected with others. And third, a perceived lack of shared understanding and experiences made it difficult for autistic adults to feel connected with others. And this was described as not fitting in, not being understood, and being misunderstood. As explained earlier by Janina and Ailsa, these barriers were associated with negative experiences in mental health services. And it could be because engaging in mental health services is also a form of social interaction. This could actually highlight the importance of understanding loneliness in autistic adults to improve experiences with mental health services for autistic people. The autistic adults in this study highlighted having Meaningful relationships with others was important, giving a sense of emotional connectedness and access to people that they can confide in when needed. Autistic adults emphasized that the quality of relationships was more important than the quantity of relationships. Connecting with similar others was more important than, well, connecting with similar others was felt to be particularly important. Autistic adults reported that they often saw similar others through their shared interests and shared autistic identity. Another way that autistic adults reported building meaningful relationships, meaningful connections, was spending time with pets and animals. For some autistic adults, meaningful relationships were reported between them and one other person, emphasizing their reliance on one person and fear of losing that person. While having quality relationships was reported to provide autistic adults with the connections they wanted, they also expressed concerns about what would happen when they lose their one person. Some autistic adults felt that coming to terms with the tensions between the desire for connection and the challenges with social interaction alleviated their feelings of loneliness. This understanding and accepting of oneself helped them to be, in a participant words, more secure in who I am. I feel less lonely, value alone time, and choose who I connect with more carefully. Other participants reported that they came to terms with their feelings of loneliness. One participant said, I'm more immune to it, learned to live with it. For some, accepting loneliness as part of their experiences alleviated loneliness. A participant said, I have accepted it is part of life for everyone, just to different degrees of importance. Based on the findings from my research, I developed the paradoxical loneliness loop model to explain loneliness in autistic adults. Autistic adults do desire social relationships with others, but experience multiple barriers to build such relationships. That could leave them exhausted, and being exhausted from social interactions itself could also be a barrier. Because social interaction can be tiring, autistic adults need to take a step back from social interaction, again leaving them lonely. Future research needs to evaluate this model, but I hope this helps many to better understand loneliness in autistic adults. There were some key insights into loneliness in autistic adults from my research. First, autistic adults experienced a dilemma when weighing the desire for social connection with their limited energy, and the refraining from social interactions do not necessarily reflect their unwillingness in social participation. Second, feelings of disconnection from others and lack of societal understanding and acceptance of autism underpin loneliness. And third, ways to alleviate loneliness appear to be by having or connecting with significant or similar others and through acceptance of autistic differences. Thank you for listening to this webinar. And if you'd like to reach out to us, here is our contact information.
Thank you, Kana, and thank you to all of our speakers today for such insightful presentations. We do have time, I think, for a couple of questions. So we had one early on bear with me. We had one early on from Maria. I think you've all touched on the fact that existing mental health outcome measures might not be as appropriate for autistic people. Maria asks, I'm interested to know if you have any suggestions for alternative outcome measures that might be more appropriate for quantifying progress for autistic people. Who wants to start with that?
I could mention a little bit if that's helpful. I mean, it is a really important point and it's a great question. There is actually a lot of research. You could have a whole webinar on this topic, looking at existing measures and evaluating those, and also looking at amendments to those measures and also developing new ones. So I guess I wouldn't like to say too much more, except to say, I guess that again, it is that quite lengthy research process and cycle in terms of developing a measure, trying it out, and then gathering data to make sure that it is the right kind of measure. I suspect that doesn't really answer the question, but just trying to put it into context, I think.
Brilliant, thank you, Ailsa. Another question that we had come through, or we had a few comments actually relating to basically the sensory environment, the impact that can have on an autistic person's experience of mental health services. So what can be done to make the environment of mental health settings more accessible for autistic people?
Shall I say a little bit maybe to start off with, and then anyone else can chip in as well?
Yeah.
I think in general, just being mindful of potentially sensory overload and reducing sensory stimuli. But I think it's also important, especially if working one-to-one, to ask the person in front of you what they find helpful. I've also talked to a few autistic people that we're sort of saying it's like a tick box exercise. People turn the fluorescent light off and think they're being accommodating. And actually there might be specific things for that person that is distracting or equally might be soothing for them and might help them to feel at ease. So I think it's really important to communicate with the people that are accessing the services. I don't know if anyone has something to add to that.
No, I would agree completely with Janina that people's needs can be very individual. So I think it's been aware of the different adjustments that's possible, but asking the person what would be particularly helpful for them and important.
I think it's also important to remember that making accommodations for autistic people actually could help other clients as well, and maybe making more universal changes, universal good changes in mental health services, and then we consider any more accommodations for autistic people would be really nice.
Brilliant, thank you all. We have a question from Amy now. Are alexithymia and masking reasons why professionals might not pick up on autistic people's mental health difficulties until they become more severe? For those who aren't familiar with the term in the audience, alexithymia is essentially difficulty with identifying what you're feeling and things like that. So would anyone like to pick that one up?
I can start off. I think that is, again, it's a great question and a really astute point, very knowledgeable. And I think certainly alexithymia can be a reason why people may themselves not quite often be aware and whether they should be seeking help or need it, as well as professionals perhaps not picking it up and not having a kind of good shared communication about what's going on. So certainly alexithymia and masking are reasons that might impact on how somebody presents to mental health services and how somebody else might make sense of that. I'm just agreeing with the question.
That makes sense, thank you. We've had a question here from Kate. What additional barriers are there for autistic people who are also part of other minoritized groups, and how could we address these? I don't know, yeah, again, who wants to pick that one up? I appreciate it's a very big question, but I think an important one.
I mean, I can make a start of it. It is a really good question, and I think a massive issue, not only for autistic people, but generally out there for everyone else as well. And it's, I think, partly to do with who trusts mental health services and why some people might be more hesitant to engage with them, but also who they speak to, and so what mental health services can do to adapt and be more accessible. Yeah, I also think that there needs to be more inclusion in research, because research can inform some practices. And if we're sort of only having a certain group of people's experience in our research, that might perpetuate some of those things who services are better attuned to. I don't know if someone else has anything else to add to that.
If you do, then absolutely, feel free to use the chat and so on, and we can follow up later. but for now, in the interest of time, I'll move on to another one. Kana, this is, I think, more aimed at your presentation, though obviously you're all welcome to chip in. What are your thoughts on the idea that loneliness might come from having a different sensory and attention system and a way of understanding the world?
Yeah, so I think it's definitely, having different views on the world and having different sensory experiences and attention experiences has impact on how autistic people experience loneliness, because loneliness majorly comes from how one interacts with the social world. And yeah, I might not be understanding this question very well.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think in the interest of time, we might have to leave it there. But thank you so much for all of your questions. They really do allow us to dig deeper into what our speakers have been sharing and help us all understand even more. We appreciate that this obviously has covered some very difficult topics today. So if this webinar has had an impact on your own mental health, please do take some time to decompress after the session. And remember that if you need them, Samaritans are available on the phone at 116 123 or by email at joe@samaritans.org, and hopefully that will go into the chat as well. If you found this webinar useful, please consider making a small donation to Autistica by visiting our website, autistica.org.uk. On our website, you can also sign up to hear about our future webinars and the latest in autism research, including how you can get involved. All that's left for me to say is a huge thank you to Janina, Ailsa, and Kana for sharing their work with us today and for answering our audience's questions so thoughtfully. It's been an absolute pleasure having you with us. Thank you all so much.